I'm your host Helen Douthwaite Teasdale, and welcome to Brass Evolution, a show which incorporates some of my favourite things: history, podcasts, and of course the brass band movement. I'm very excited to bring you this first episode where we'll be chatting to Gavin Holman, owner of internet bandsman Everything Within, about how band histories are discovered, recorded, and saved for the future. So, Gavin, for those who don't know you, could you give us a brief introduction to yourself?
Well, I'm Gavin Holman. I currently have been a tuba player with the Harrogate band for many, many years. And I suppose really got first interest in the history of bands probably about 30 years ago. I'd started off developing the Harrogate band's website, and as part of that, it had a whole load of sort of links as people used to have in the early days. In fact, the Harrogate band was one of the first bands to have a website. As those links to other things grew over time, they suddenly took on a life of their own, and that's when I first put the IBW together, which is sort of a main sort of resource for bands on the internet. And following on from that, I started to collect more information about bands of the past, which then became a bit of a sort of an activity in its own right, as far as my own personal life was concerned. And everything has just grown since then. I was going to give you my personal background is that of computers and books and libraries. I ended up my professional career when I retired as the head of IT infrastructure for the British Library. So I had access to a wonderful range of resources, which I'd made use of over the years, and helped actually to sort of cement the foundations really for the research and the work that I and others were doing.
I was going to say, when you started off the Harrogate band website, I think I'm a child of the 90s, Gavin, so the internet was my playground for a very long time, and I do remember that IBW was one of the first websites where you could actually search for bands in a sense, and I definitely used it.
Yeah.
And I think so. When you started compiling these links, did you find that people were just sending you lots and lots of information, and then it was like, okay, well, where do we put all of this?
It was a combination of things. I mean, partly I suppose the ethos of the early internet was that people wanted to get stuff out there to share and all the rest of it, and so there was a lot of help going around, and people did send a heck of a lot of stuff to me, and they wanted to get their bits put in and their own websites and their own information promulgated. So it was very useful. Over the years, it built up quite considerably, and apart from the sort of the reference information and links to other websites, which weren't just band websites, they were professional players. There were the actual sort of business areas like the publishers and the instrument manufacturers, you name it, anything to do with bands really. And I also added stuff along the lines of deputy players, professional cards, an events directory, so that bands could publish their events. So on each day you could sort of log in and see what's happening across the country with band concerts. And that went on.
It really was a one-stop shop.
Yeah,
this was before Googling and bands, social media and things like this. It was kind of like everything was compiled in the one place, which was absolutely fantastic, I've got to say.
Yeah. Sadly, come the sort of about 6-7 years ago, possibly with the increased social media and things, the willingness, shall we say, of bands and people to sort of contribute that sort of peripheral information like events and things to do with their own bands sort of started to die down. It became impossible to maintain, so I had to sort of shut those bits off. So I concentrate more now on recording the history.
I was going to say, so when did you start sort of researching and recording the brass band histories? Obviously, people were sending you a lot of information. Was there any sort of research that you did initially that started that sort of journey for you?
No, it was just a general sort of case of you get to some sort of critical mass, at which point you realise that you have got something here that is a collection of material and information that not only is worthwhile in its own right, really ought to be seen more widely. And particularly, I think it was my listing of extinct bands that really kicked things off. That was started off in the website, and then I did a couple of years worth of research and added a significant number of bands to that, and then published it as an online book. So that was really, I think, the main start. But other things were happening in between that. Other pieces of information that have been collected. That's one of the things that the IBEW helped to do, was provide a focus for this information to flow into, and partly flow out again as well. But also, I kept quite a bit of it myself as sort of triggers for future bits of work or bits of research.
Absolutely. I was going to say there's probably quite a lot of people and a lot of bands that do their own sort of individual research, or like local history groups like that, and then they're all in these sort of separate silos, and IBW definitely sort of brought the focus there, and for basically brought it all together. Which is,
my main sort of thrust in certainly the last 20 years has been to try and collect information that's out there and make it available, on via either on IBW or via IBW, and allow people access to it, but also use it as a sort of a launching point or starting point for people to actually, get into this themselves. I mean, I've lost count of the number of times I've been contacted by people who want advice or help or information, or whether it's someone who wants to know something genealogically about their great grandfather who they think played in a band, or whether it's an academic who's writing a thesis on X, Y, and Z, and wants to know either what to do about X, or where he find information. It's a joy, I think, I find, to be able to do this sort of thing, because not only do I get things back in terms of information ultimately from people who find things out, and then bring it back to me, but also it helps to promulgate the band's histories. Otherwise, they're going to get lost. The number of times you hear about people who are upset because their great grandfather or whoever grandfather has died, and that information about his life and the bands he was in has just been lost to the ether, and you never get that sort of information back. And there's so little, in terms of the written word, that again, it's trying to make sure that what you have got, or we have got, is kept, maintained, digitized, scanned, archived, whatever, so it is there for posterity. That's really, one of my driving forces.
I think we're in an age now where we can sort of capture sort of people's living memories and band and histories much more easily with all the technology we have at our disposal. But it's getting to the point where some of this really critical information could potentially get lost into the ether. So that's why the work that you do and everyone that supports IBEW is so important. Talk us through the process, Gavin. How do you get started sort of discovering information? Do you pick specific topics to get started with, or do you just have lots and lots on the go all at once?
Short answer to that is I have lots and lots on the go all at once. Unfortunately, I quite often get distracted. It happens that I'll come across a piece of information or a photograph, and quite often that will then either ring a faint bell or make me go, "Oh gosh, I never knew that." And I find myself going down a rabbit hole of either research on the internet or somewhere else, and ending up with a new topic to investigate. I currently have about 20 or so topics pending. Wow. There's a number of specific bands, such as old ones like Baxendales, Dodsworths, Hepworth Ironworks, Irwell Springs, one of the rifle volunteer bands from Cumbria, Ulverston, and of course, my own band, Harrogate. I've got a whole lot of information about that, which is definitely needs.
Is that on the back burner?
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, the IBEW and my interest was originally entirely brass band related, and traditional brass band related.
Yeah.
Over the years, that has spread much wider, partly because in the early days there wasn't such a thing as a traditional brass band, and the bands had variety of different instrumentations. bands in other countries have come up in a similar sort of evolutionary pattern, but ended up in different ways. And to be frank, the whole brass ensemble in its widest term movement across the world is quite fascinating. And as a result, a lot of the stuff on the IPW now encompasses that, so that the whole sort of family of brassy music is covered. And I find some of the aspects of it quite intriguing. So a number of my sort of articles have been touching on areas of these. I also find children's bands, particularly the institutional orphanage bands, interesting. I've done quite a bit of work on the ladies in banding, both in terms of the ladies' bands themselves, of which there were quite a few, particularly in the USA, but also the female instrumentalists and the brass players. Again, there were some wonderful lady cornet players in particular, but also trombonists and horn players.
Of course.
In the 19th
I'm
century.
completely biased.
Yes. But, you don't hear about them, and they make barely a ripple in history, and it's so sad. On the flip side, there's this sort of ephemeral side of aspects of the banding arena. You have things like comic bands, which are slightly, off to one side. They may contain brass instruments, they may be all brass instruments, but quite often they contain sort of kazoo and zobo type instruments. But they were part of the banding fabric in this country and the USA. And I've got a number of those bubbling away as to investigate. And then there's the lists of and sort of directories of types of bands. I've looked in the past at the bands associated with industry, so the works bands, the mills bands, the motorworks band, so forth and so on, and also to some extent the bands associated with the, as I said earlier, the institutional children's homes. But I've also got markers in to look at bands associated with political parties, some of the religious organisations, particularly the Rechabites, and a lot more work on the training ships, which were set up partly to provide musicians for the Navy, but also somewhere they could house all these either orphan or lads who were not quite ready for normal schools, shall we say.
Yes, yeah. I just find this so fascinating that this is all so intertwined. It's all intertwined, and I don't know, we can kind of look at brass bands in isolation, but there's so many external factors and other things happening in the musical sphere that, yeah, I can totally understand why you kind of start looking at one thing and then something else comes in and changes your line of investigation, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't think we can be too isolationist in terms of the brass band world. It's nice to have our own 25 players plus percussion and rules and regulations and all the rest of it. We have to be considerate of the wider brass environment. Apart from anything else, we're almost like we're fighting a losing battle. We're certainly continue to fight the battle of our existence against other entertainment outlets for people, and the fact that we historically have an aging audience and all the rest of it. So there are issues there that we've got to deal with. But I suppose one of the interesting things is that I think, and my research sort of shows it to some extent, that despite what people think, the number of bands in Britain today is roughly the same as it was around in the 1950s. There's not been a huge decline since that time. We're running around about the 1,200 mark across the country. Now, that's a big drop from the peak, which was in about 1895, when around 5,000 bands were in existence. And obviously there was a big drop after World War One, and then again after World War Two. But since the sort of early mid-50s, it's been largely static.
That contradicts what I the work that you do is so important to sort of bolster that, because I was under the impression that we were drastically declined and we were on a downward decline. But actually what you're saying is that we've kind of, the numbers have sort of basically remained steady, which is fantastic. And obviously, there's no way we can ever get back to the numbers of in sort of industrial and bands linked to every sort of industry across the UK and the world. But yeah, that makes me feel very optimistic.
I think so. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, there are bands that have folded, other new bands have been created.
Of course.
I don't, it's too early to say what the results of the pandemic are going to be, and I suspect that will have another downwards effect. But we can be optimistic at least. Yeah.
What's your best advice for people wanting to start out doing their own research?
I think it depends entirely on what it is you're trying to look at. Obviously, Mr. Internet is a wonderful resource.
Of course.
It is but one of a whole range of different resources you can get hold of. I mean, one of the main things that we've got to consider now is that there's so much information out there in terms of physical archives, be it in museums or libraries, local history societies, and other places such as that is largely untapped, largely unknown, apart from it being inside someone's catalogue. That's not counting the stuff that people have in individuals have in their own houses, their own records, even their own heads. So when you sort of say to someone, well, where do I go from here? How do I find out more? It is largely a case of, well, what is it you want to do? How do you want to find out? Is it about an individual? Is it about a band? Is it about a process? Is it about an organisation? You try and personally, I try and sort of push people towards the right sort of areas of research. I can't be specific in most cases, but you can at least give them a few pointers. A number of the pointers were in existence in the IBW in early years, and I've worked those up into a guide for those researching for bands, so that the document called "Researching the History of Brass Bands" is now available on the website and gives access to a whole list of different areas you can investigate, both in terms of sort of websites you can go to, or the organisations you can contact, or even the types of groups that might be of use to you in your search. For example, if you're looking into the bands of fraternal organisations, it gives you a few pointers about people like the Round Table and the Masons and so forth that you can actually contact and find out more information. Over the years, I've built a whole range of contacts with other researchers and historians and academics who have helped me a lot, and hopefully I've helped them in a little way. But also, it means I've got the odd contact. I can say, well, he or she is actually looking into that sort of area or that sort of aspect of musicianship. And put them in contact.
Such a fantastic wealth of resources that you've compiled. I'll definitely put links to, obviously, the IBW website and also the links for the resources for bands. But I think sometimes you could potentially get a little bit daunted, overwhelmed. Like, where do I start? If somebody's trying to sort of look at the history of an entire band and it goes back to the early 1900s, you could be very overwhelmed very quickly. So Gavin has put a fantastic set of resources together to sort of set you on your journey there. So Gavin, there's a fantastic community around brass band histories. I know that there's sort of Facebook groups and other groups out there, and these people have probably gone through the process themselves or are in the middle of some research, and there could, people are out there to help you, basically, I would say.
Oh, certainly. I mean, you mentioned the Facebook group. I set that up some years back now, and it's got probably 4,000 members. Sounds a lot, but I think a number of those are not real members, shall we say, as it is with Facebook. And a number of those are sitting there and keeping an eye on things from time to time. But there are people who are actively doing research and also who are contributing quite considerably to the information that's is pulled into that group, and is very, very effective in that way. So it is yet another way of making sure that A, information is shared, and B, that it is passed on elsewhere so that people can either enjoy it or include it in their own research. One of the other things I've got on the IBW website is a starting list of books, for example, for those who are interested in band history, but aren't specifically looking for any a particular story or band, just to give them, read about stuff list. So hopefully that's, of use to people as well.
What's the most interesting or memorable discovery you've made?
Oh dear.
I know, tricky question.
There's so many. One of the things I find so interesting is it's the delight that when you find something that's either unknown or little known, and allows you to sort of say, "Oh, that's really good," or it's the eureka or aha moment. There's a couple perhaps. One is it had been long thought that in 1845 at Burton Constable, that was the first real brass band contest. And it was documented quite thoroughly by Enderby Jackson. And, that really was enshrined as the start of contesting in Britain. But I did a little bit of digging, which ended up being a lot more digging, and discovered several contests that existed in the 2 decades before that. That also had, links to some of the earlier military band contests in France. So that was a new chunk of information. I thought, oh, that's good to know.
Absolutely.
And the other thing was, I've looked into various family bands. These are bands of usually family members who quite often, particularly in the USA, used to tour around and basically have a sort of vaudeville type life on the circuit. And there was one particular band. Again, this started with a photograph that I actually found in an antique shop several years ago. And at the time, I didn't know what it was, but I have since found out that it was one of the photographs of the Tyler family band. Tyler was a musician who had 2 wives, 13 children, and with those 13 children had 2 separate bands.
Wow.
And he toured both in the UK and in France for about 50 years in the 1800s. They had several spots as the town band in places like Aberystwyth. The photograph I have was particularly interesting because it's taken on the steps of one of the buildings here in Harrogate in 1872 when they visited as part of a tour around the country. They are particularly interesting for a second reason, and that is they are the first recorded band to have a remotely transmitted concert.
Wow. Okay.
Which they did via telephone
Wow.
in Bradford in 1882.
That's incredible.
It is, yeah. I'd done some work previously, both on the early recording technologies for brass bands, and I wrote a paper on that, and a similar one on the early broadcasting elements of brass bands. Those are mainly around the area of the first broadcasts in the 1920s when the BBC first came along, but there were previous broadcasts before that, both on telephone and telegraph lines. But this Tyler family one was new to me, and it just added another, piece in the jigsaw of banding history.
Well, thank you so much, Gavin, for all that information. I feel like everyone needs to have a look on your website ASAP, especially if you're thinking about doing some research into brass band histories, whether individuals, conductors, contests, bands, extinct bands, it's all there. Where can we find you, Gavin, and how can people get in touch with you?
The simple answer is via the IBEW website. It's www.ibew.co.uk. Contact details are on there. All of my articles and books are there for research, download, whatever people want to do. And I'm always open to helping people if they've got questions or queries. It helps that we've got some way now of actually collecting all this material together, both in the digital space and in the physical space. It's very good to see, for example, that finally the brass band archive has been relocated now to Heritage Quay in Huddersfield after being in limbo for so many years. And that, I think, plus the Salford University repository are 2 significant archives of banding history that can only grow over time. and certainly my own personal collection, we'll be heading that way.
Extensive, I'm sure.
It is slightly, yes. I mean, apart from all the stuff on the website, I've personally got quite a large number of books and material of historical bent about bands. I've also managed to collect a whole range of electronic PDFs of articles and books, which again, can and will be made available. They're not currently available through the IBEW website, partly because of potential copyright issues with some of them.
Sure.
But they will be, heading towards one of the archives in due course as well. So it's the main thing is that I do want to have some sense that the histories that people are researching and writing and publishing are going to remain in the public domain and accessible, for the future. And it's only through significant archives like the Brass Band Archive and the universities that this stuff's going to be protected and preserved. We don't really know yet what the digital archiving future is going to hold. I mean, places like the British Library are looking into this and are doing their own thing in terms of archiving a small amount of the web, but a lot more research needs to be done in that respect. So that despite having something like the IPW in existence, it's not guaranteed that material is going to be there in 50 years' time. So, that's another person's problem, I think. But it just highlights that, it's not just, ephemeral paper that, causes problems for keeping this material live.
IBEW has certainly gone a long way to collecting so much information, which is absolutely fantastic. And the fact that it's free to access, and this is a very we're a friendly bunch, I think, and people very much go a long way to sort of sharing information, sharing content, and it's just a great place to get started if people are wanting to look into history. So Gavin, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure I'll be in touch again.
I'm sure
Gavin is a wealth of knowledge. And I'd like to thank you just there now. Thanks, Gavin.
It was a pleasure talking to you. And obviously, anytime you or anybody else, wants to get in touch, I'm happy to be here.
I really hope you enjoyed episode 1. If you like the podcast, please help it to grow by liking, sharing, rating, and reviewing. Every episode, a portion of the ad revenue is donated to an organisation chosen by our guest. This week, it will be the Internet Bandsman's Everything Within. Podcast music is Mephistopheles, performed by the Illinois Brass Band.